Well, welcome to Everyday Torah. My name is Trevor. Of course, every one of you probably recognizes Jacob by now, one of our resident, I'll just call him a scholar teacher for now, and regular country bumpkin that raises animals.
Professional country bumpkin.
That's right. Professional. You get paid to do this? Well, I guess if you sold an egg every so often. I don't know. Well, I've been under the weather and out of state doing a lot of things, and I had to take a little pause. So I'm glad to be back with you, brother. Jacob gave me my my reading assignment. When we're doing this podcast, Jacob will send me the text that he'd like to cover, and I read that last night. So we've got Acts 21 in our purview today. James 2, James 4. Jacob's going to cover something at the end of James 4 that I think will, I don't know if I'm perplexed about it, but I haven't fit all the pieces together. In James chapter 2, James refers to the law of liberty and is very explicit what he is referring to in that text. And a lot of people use James, the phrasing law of liberty, as a way to, get rid of the law, and maybe we'll cover that as well. So, Jacob, you're starting though in Acts 21, which I think number one is great for me, and the reason is that when I'm talking about Acts 15. To talk about Acts 15 without also including a discussion of Acts 21, I think you got to do that, don't you think?
Yeah, I am partial, yes. But no, I think that logically you have to, because they're linked, and we're going to see why they're linked. For me, Paul is a consistent person, and it's because Paul serves a consistent God. And one of the things that I unfortunately was taught, I know many others are taught, is that Paul is this pragmatic theologian. And at least this is how he's taught in universities and seminaries, is that he's a pragmatic theologian. So again, that verse we covered last time we podcasted, to the Jew I'm a Jew, to the Gentile a Gentile, I'm all things to all people in order that I might win some to Christ. And so what's portrayed is an individual who, when he's around Jews, he acts Jewish and keeps the law. When he's around Gentiles, he doesn't keep the law.
I distinctly remember in seminary that one of my New Testament profs called it theology on the run, and that Paul
I've heard that term.
I don't know if he put Paul in the shapeshifter category, but he basically, anyone who tries to understand Paul in a way that rids of the law has to deal with texts that seems to make Paul into a shapeshifter, a changer of some sort. And the only way you can do that, I think, is if you think that the only thing you need to theologize about is salvation. No. So even in James, when we cover this today, James is concerned about the health of the church. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's about sanctification too. It's about walking in a particular way. So anyway, I just want to say, this is I think a big issue in seminaries, that people think that Paul changes.
It is, and it's not that I have a problem with somebody saying Paul's pragmatic, because Paul's very pragmatic.
Sure.
There's nothing wrong in making that statement, but he's not pragmatic in the way that he is taught he is pragmatic. And I would go so far as to say that he is represented as a person who, like I said, he'll change if he's around the Jews or he's around the Gentiles, almost chameleon-like. And to me, when I look at how Paul tries to represent himself, like statements such as, I am telling the truth, I am not lying. When he makes an explicit statement like that, it seems like well, it's explicit that he wants people to know he's telling the truth. And he also makes statements like, or I should say, pertaining to liars, and says that, no liar has any part in the kingdom of God.
Mm-hmm.
So I find it incompatible when people say that he's acting one way in one scenario, one way in another scenario, and somehow have that be just pragmatic. To me, that's deceptive.
Oh, it is. In Acts 21, if he is paying the vow temple tax for these guys, just as a act of showmanship, that would be deceptive.
And that's where I want to go with today, because I want to show, this is one of those passages where I have had it taught to me that, well, Paul didn't really keep the law, but he succumbed to peer pressure from James, and so he did it. And this isn't necessarily Paul's finest hour, but this is Paul being a pragmatic theologian. And my contention is that, well, it's not so much a contention, so much as a question, is this. Is Paul a deceptive person and capitulated to peer pressure, or has he been keeping Torah the whole time? And at the same time, is James abusing his position as an elder and forcing Paul to do something he doesn't want to do? Or is he telling the truth and providing prudent guidance to Paul that there is no truth to what some in Jerusalem were saying about him instructing people to break Torah? So that's where I want to focus on, just for this, the springboard, and then we'll go from there.
Okay.
I don't think it's necessary to read all of Acts 21, because the first half of it has to do with his journey. He's making his way back up to Jerusalem. He comes to the house of Philip the evangelist, and then at that house, a prophet comes and gives, the prophet's name's Agabus, this is verse 10, takes Paul's belt, binds his feet, binds his hands, and Agabus binds his own feet and hands, and says, this is what the Holy Spirit says, this is what's going to happen to the person who owns this belt. And so everybody tries to keep Paul, don't go, and he says, no, I'm going. And they all say, all right, well, the will of the Lord shall be done. So he heads to Jerusalem. So that's the first 16 verses.
Yeah.
So
if I may, I know this has nothing to do with the law or anything like that, but I was reading through that, thinking about the character of Paul. He knows that these are, Agabus is a prophet, and then there's the prophetesses. I think it's Philip's daughters.
Yeah, it's four that prophesy.
Yeah. But just think about Paul getting to a place in his life where, even though he knows it is by the Spirit that they're prophesying, because it says in the text that that's what happens. Mm-hmm. He is ready to die for our Messiah. You know, this isn't just about some. People always talk to me like, "Oh, you're trying to follow Yeshua by the law and all that." Like, you understand that Jacob's in my heart want to be like Paul. It's not just about the law. It's I want to train myself in such a way that I would go even beyond that to die for our Messiah. And I saw that in Paul. I felt it in him as I read through that. So I just want to say, it's not just Paul going to ultimately evangelize, prove a point, and he wants to be in Jerusalem for a particular reason. But it's just the whole character of who Paul is at this point. I'm just like, oh my gosh, I really want to be like that guy.
Yeah, me too. And the thing is, Paul's just acting like his Messiah.
Yeah.
I mean, thy will be done. That's Yeshua's. And it's interesting, if we have more time, perhaps another time, our fellowship did that study on Acts for a good chunk of time.
Yeah.
One of the things that we came to realize was that the story of Acts deliberately parallels the suffering of Paul in many ways to the suffering of Yeshua. There's key phrases. So one of these phrases we just read here in verse 14, let the will of the Lord be done.
Yeah.
This is his Gethsemane moment.
Yeah.
When Yeshua says, nevertheless, thy will be done, if you can take this cup, take it from me.
Yeah.
But not my will. your will. And so that's what these group of people with Paul says, thy will, all right, let the will of the Lord be done. And they send him on his way. And one final note, how many believers would be willing to receive that prophetic word today?
Oh.
In the midst of the Lord wants the best thing for your life, and that includes a car in every garage, 2 vacation homes. He doesn't want you to suffer.
Hey, I watch a bunch of Christian movies, and everyone gets the nice thing at the very end.
It's always a happy ending.
Oh,
it's always a happy ending when it comes to this life. And I truly do wonder, how I wonder, because everybody who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted, and that's Paul's words. So I think,
hey, I'm with you. It's not a popular message.
It's not.
But what can we do? We
preach Christ crucified.
That's right. That's what we do.
Acts 21 verse 17. This is where I'll start reading. When we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly, and this is Luke providing the narration. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. So this is James, the brother of Yeshua. This is not John's brother James. That James sadly was executed by Herod because it pleased the Jews, and that was earlier in the book of Acts. So this is Yeshua's brother James. And all the elders were present. After greeting them, he greeted one by one the things that God had done amongst the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard it, they glorified God. And they said to him, you see, brother, how many thousands there are amongst the Jews of those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law. And they have been told about you, that you teach all the Jews who are amongst the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. What then is to be done? So I'll pause there. So he relates what God is doing amongst the Gentiles. And the concern is the thousands of the Jews who have believed are all zealous for the law. So I want to put this in context. There are no Jews that have believed in Yeshua in this context that in any way, shape, or form think they are released from the law. So I just want to lay that groundwork just out of the gate.
Certainly.
These are the people who Yeshua went to first. That's out of his own words. He says, I've been sent to the lost sheep of Israel. Right? So, and they are to start their ministry in Jerusalem, then Judea, then Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. So James and the other elders are saying, look, all these Jews that have believed, many thousands, that's a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
They're all zealous for the law, and they've been told. So this is where the slander comes in, because it's not true. And I think we've covered in enough podcasts previously to demonstrate that Paul is very consistent. You and your Romans podcast have, I think, beyond a shadow of a doubt, demonstrated that Paul is a consistent Torah keeper, and that those who come to faith in Yeshua are being conformed to the image of our Messiah bit by bit. To those who lived in ignorance, it takes longer, right? Because you don't have the primer. You don't have the covenant primer that the Jews had, not the Jews, but, well, not Jews alone, but the Israel as a whole, the two houses. So, point being, there's a rumor out there, and it's slander, that Paul is teaching people, specifically the Jews amongst the Gentiles, to forsake Moses, telling them to not circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. It's just, that's a flat out lie.
Yeah, and for those who don't have the background, it does seem to say that Paul says, hey, don't become circumcised, but it is referring to, it's not saying don't circumcise your kids, it's don't become part of the circumcision party. Don't become a part of the people who think that they are saved by works through the Mosaic or Sinaitic covenant.
Right.
Yeah, and he's coming against that.
Because he circumcises Timothy. So that's one of the things that's interesting, is that that's also in the book of Acts, is that it says, for the sake of the Jews that were amongst them, Timothy was circumcised. Now, the reason that was a conundrum with Timothy was that his father was a Greek.
Mm-hmm.
His mother was a Gentile.
Right.
That was one of legal bearing, because in those types of households, the father, the pater, had authority. So it's entirely possible that Timothy's dad might actually have been like anti-circumcision, even though his mother was Jewish. So that's why that was contentious. It wasn't necessarily that Paul did it because there was this massive Jewish pressure. It's that Timothy rightfully came from a Jewish heritage. And so there could have been unnecessary conflict there. And so, being prudent, he said, Timothy, yeah, you need to do this. And so he did it. And there's questions there about whether or not maybe Paul became Timothy's adoptive father.
Mm-hmm.
There's many references to Paul as Timothy's son. So, and Paul speaks so highly of Timothy that he loves him. He just, as his own son, he's just this wonderful son relationship.
For sure.
So back to Acts 21 here. It's not true that Paul is teaching the Jews to not circumcise their children, nor does he say to not walk according to the custom of Moses. Now, one of the things that is difficult here is this word custom. It's a loaded term, and in the Greek, it's Atheism, and the Greek word Atheism has this it has this connotation of just, if you were to rip it completely out of its context, as almost a dogmatic practice, tradition, if you will. But that word is generally dogma. Generally speaking, when you see that somebody's dogmatic
Mm-hmm.
in their ways, or they walk according to dogma can be translated as tradition, and that's more of like a hardliner verb. The atheism itself is not as rigid, will we say. It can be translated as custom, as habit, according to custom, according to law. It can be also according to tradition. The generic sense of the word is that it's a practice. It's a customary way of operation or behavior. So when you say custom, I think it unnecessarily, it's not a bad translation. It's not one of those instances where I think it's a deliberately misleading translation.
Yeah.
I don't think it's the best word choice. I think that walking according to our practice is a better flushing out of the word, because it doesn't denote law of Moses from the oral law standpoint.
Yeah, no, good. That's good to know. And the reason I say that is that as I read it myself, I didn't know the Greek word behind that, because there's a connotative part to that word. And I did think to myself, it does seem to me that James is giving the instruction to pay the temple tax in part to both say that, hey, Paul follows the law and the customs. And I thought to myself, I don't think Paul or James is, advocating. Let's just take a hand washing in Mark 7. That these are the super extemporaneous. The
etilatadayim, the washing of the hands.
Yeah, all the extra stuff. It would just. I think. When I wondered about this, and I'm glad that you brought it up, because it seems to me he's talking about what would be in the Torah and how the Jewish community would have exercised Passover at that time. Pentecost at that time, just the Torah stuff, but how would they have done it?
Right. And so here, and again, let's put Paul in context of what he said consistently through those letters. Romans 3:21 says, "Do we therefore abolish the law by this grace? By no means. We uphold the law." So can we please stop? And Romans is considered the high point of his theology. So even if he wrote Romans at the end or towards the end of his life, that is Paul's conclusion of the matter.
Sure.
So if you're talking about 50-plus-year-old Paul, who's a mature man, an older man in the Lord now, I mean, I don't know how much more explicit it has to be. So we need to start reconciling Paul to be a man of integrity. It's really important. That's one of the reasons that the Torah says you're not to entertain an accusation against an elder of your people except on the basis of 2 or more witnesses, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, he doesn't say it in Torah, but he says it in Timothy. But you shouldn't. Let's actually consider a person's character here. And Paul is not a liar. So, nor is he a deceitful person. He's just not. If he's a liar or a deceiver, by his own litmus test for those who inherit the kingdom, by Revelation's estimation of who enters the kingdom, Paul's not going to enter the kingdom if he's willfully a deceiver and a liar. So, these are the things that I don't think people ask the right question.
Sure.
About the narrative, because it's a mutually exclusive reality. Paul can't be a liar and be a servant of Messiah. He just can't. Those two things can't mutually coexist. So in Acts 21, James asks the question, he's like, there's this rumor going around. What are we supposed to do? It says, they will certainly hear that you have come. We can't keep this secret. Do therefore what we tell you. So this is where the coercion aspect comes into play, and people say, well, James is using his authority here to get Paul to do something that he doesn't want to do. So it says, do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expense, so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing to what they have told about you, or what they've been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. But as for well, I'll stop there. So James' recommendation, and really it's the group of elders as a whole. This isn't just James. If you notice the language here, do therefore what we tell you. This isn't James by himself unilaterally as a dictator telling Paul what to do. Remember the context of the statement. It says that he was with James and all the elders were present. So that is a high chance Peter could have been there.
Sure.
John could have been there, and any number of the other apostles who had not been martyred at this point were present. So let's put things in the proper context here. This is not just James saying this. James is not, he's maybe the chief elder, so to speak, if you will, in the sense that perhaps he has received the greater honor, one being recognized as maybe the leader of the church I use that term loosely, church, let's say the assembly, the ecclesia in Jerusalem. He's the one that's been recognized. So Luke in Acts names drops James, but it's all the elders here who are saying this of one accord. So now you've got a more dramatic problem than you had before, because if you want to maintain the line of reasoning that Paul is being bullied into doing something he doesn't want to do, you've got all the elders behind this. So now what you have to logically say is that you've got all of the elders forcing him to do something he doesn't want to do. And
that's not the case. They're elders just functioning as elders.
They're exercising wisdom. They're being prudent here.
Right.
And saying, look, Paul, we know there's nothing to this. Well, we've got a situation here. This is what we would like for you to do. We would like for you to go ahead and take these men who are under a vow. And we'd like for you to pay to have them go through their purification ritual. Okay? That's it. There's nothing there's nothing heinous behind this. Now, it is in the imperative. Do this. Okay, so it's a poieson. So it is a command. But this is not a heinous command. This is not a deceitful command. This is the council of elders who are in faith in Yeshua, and Paul submits to authority. Not because it's not what he doesn't believe, but because this is a group of elders who are leading the fellowship, and they have determined that this is the best course of action.
Well, I'm thinking Paul's thinking this is a good idea.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and there's no, I could just see it. Talking about imperative instruction, you give imperative instruction to your son. I do the same to my son.
That's not coercion.
This is no, and it's for me it's group preaching, group proclamation. Yeah. We're demonstrating something to make something emphatically clear to everybody. Nothing wrong with that. So yeah, I see it, and I wouldn't even. Paul's not the richest man either. I wouldn't be surprised at all if I tell my son, go do something, and then I slide him a $10 bill on the way out the door. I wouldn't be surprised at all if these guys also helped Paul financially out as well. It doesn't say it in the text, but they're together in this.
Right. Well, and you have a Paul situation where he might have been the adoptive son of Paulus. That's a thing. So maybe Paul had some means, but the point is, I want the viewers, the listeners, to understand that the presuppositions that are applied to this text by what you may have been taught, that Paul is being forced to do something he didn't really believe in, that's not supported by the totality of the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament. It's just not supported by Paul's character. Mm-hmm. It's not. So you can't hold to that opinion that he's doing something that he thought was wrong. This is the man who opposed Peter to his face.
Yeah, going to Peter, by the way, if anyone had difficulty, it would have been Peter. But every time the inspired word of God tells us, and it's usually Paul, I think it's no, is it always Paul? It might be always Paul. Paul always corrects him. Don't be a shapeshifter.
Yeah.
Don't be deceitful, because he acted one way with the Gentiles, another way with the Jewish brothers, but the text of the Bible calls him on it.
Yeah, and then Peter writes a glowing review of Paul.
Yeah.
So, and that glowing review indicates, hey guys, Paul's difficult to understand. But he's actually penning scripture.
Yeah.
So you don't twist what he's saying, right? So here's the situation where Paul, the conclusion of the matter says, do this so that everybody knows this is slander, this is untrue, and that you yourself live in observance of the law. There's no compartment for that obedience to the law in modern Christianity, so to speak, nor has it been there for the last 2,000 or so years, because Paul is this law liberator person. As if Paul had the authority to liberate us from the law. He doesn't. The only one that could liberate us from the law would be the lawgiver. And that's what we're going to get to in James. But as for the Gentiles, so this is verse 25 to wrap up Acts 21. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, and this is the connection to Acts 15, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, from blood, from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality. This is Acts 15.
Yep.
And Paul was acutely aware, he had firsthand knowledge of this ruling.
Yeah.
And by the way, Paul, James, Peter, the rest of the elders, the Pharisee group, and the Gentile believers that had come to faith and were now grafted into Israel rejoiced at the decision that was reached at the Jerusalem Council.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so can we please move on to the listener, to the viewer? Can we please move on? If you're still having skepticism about Paul, please let's move on from this idea that Paul is a deceptive lawbreaker who does one thing in front of mommy and another thing in front of daddy. That's not Paul. If that's your estimation of Paul, you are not. Go reread your New Testament, please. That's not the depiction you get of Paul. This is a man of integrity. This is a man who was radically saved by Yeshua and then caused to suffer by that same Messiah for his name, and is the producer of at least 12 letters, 13 if you include Hebrews. Okay? We need to stop with this imposition upon Paul that he's a chronic lawbreaker when it suits him. That's an attack on Paul's character. That's not okay, because it's just not who he is. So, anyways, that's why I wanted to bring up Acts 21 as a bit of a continuation of what we had talked about last time, almost a month ago, crying out loud, in Acts 15. Paul the lawbreaker is just not present, and even modern scholars, N.T. Wright, and I do not agree with everything N.T. Wright writes.
Certainly,
okay?
yeah.
A lot of times, with due respect to N.T. Wright, I think N.T.'s wrong.
Oh, yeah, certainly, yeah.
But N.T. Wright has brought up a good, and he's not alone in this. He's just the one that's got the marketing to be able to put this out in the open more.
Yeah.
But there is an acknowledgement that the more we discover about the era of the New Testament from an archaeological perspective, from a writing perspective, Paul has been misrepresented.
Yeah, for our viewers, so you have N.T. Wright, you have E.P. Sanders, James Dunn. These are people that you can read. There's this thing called The New Perspective on Paul, which Jacob and I would not agree with all the conclusions there. But one of the things that modern scholarship has realized is, and everyone agrees on this, is that we have misread the person of Paul. So even though they might not come necessarily to the conclusion that the law is for Christians, what modern scholarship is not, tossing about anymore is that seems like Paul followed that law, and Paul was very much Jewish. The bottom line is, everyone agrees we've misread Paul, misread Acts 21, misread what's going on in Galatians. Everyone agrees on this. Conclusions are different, but everyone agrees that we need to revisit this and do some of the stuff that, Jacob, you're talking about right now.
I would say in the scholastic community, there's a majority consensus. There are people who don't think we've gotten this wrong. I won't name drop because I do have a respect for them, and it says the Torah says to not slander a ruler of your people.
Yeah.
So
fair enough.
There are people who disagree with this still. No, we've got Paul right. They are out there. They have powerful followings, and I'm just going to have to let the Lord handle that.
Yeah.
So that's Acts 21. Now, the question being, okay, what on earth does this have to do with James 2? Well, let's go ahead and flip over to James 2. So I'm going to pull it up here. And by the way, today I'm reading from the ESV, if anybody's curious. So I'm just going to read. My brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For a man, by the way, that's a very interesting reference, because only Yahweh can have glory. And I wonder if this is an allusion to Psalm 24.
Mm-hmm.
Where it says, lift up your heads, O you gates, be lifted up, you ancient doors, so that the King of glory, may enter in. Who is this King? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord the King of glory. Okay, so this is Yahweh language here.
Mm-hmm.
So in case people wonder what James thought of his half-brother according to the flesh, James is very James is not unaware of who Yeshua is. Okay, and I think that's you talk about a difficult pill to swallow.
Yeah.
So continuing verse 2, for if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothes comes to your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, you sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit down at my feet, have you not then made distinctions amongst yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Are not the rich? Well, you're wondering, Jacob, what on earth are you reading this for? This is really important to understand where I'm going to go in James chapter 4. So I have to read this. But you have dishonored the poor man, verse 6. Are not the rich ones who oppress you, and the ones who drag you into court? Are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you are called? So he's saying that these people, these rich ones, they blaspheme the name by which you are called. Okay, which the New Testament says that you're by the name of Yeshua. So if you're blaspheming the name of Yeshua, like, whoa, James seems to be equivocating here that if you're blaspheming the name of Yeshua, you can draw a comparison here to blaspheming the name of Yahweh. So this is a pretty serious accusation coming against these rich people. Verse 8. If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. But if you show partiality, you are committing sin and convicted by the law as transgressors. So I want to apply this idea of partiality. If Paul was in sin and not keeping the law, and James was saying no, and the elders with him are saying, we know you keep the law. If Paul is a lawbreaker, guilty of partiality or guilty of sin, if they did not call him out on his sin, they would be showing partiality and becoming transgressors as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's how quickly that argument unravels. So now you've got Paul is a deceitful person, but because the elders know that Paul's popular, they're going to capitulate and show partiality to Paul because he's popular.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're in sin. So if what is been said about Acts 21 is true historically, Paul is in sin, the elders are in sin. It's really bad sin because now they've got a frat boy club where the people that are in power get away with stuff. I mean, this is how quickly this logic does not work.
Mm-hmm.
If you just know your Torah. I mean, this is how quickly it falls apart. So he goes on, verse 10, for whoever keeps the whole law but fails at one point has become guilty of it all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. If you do not commit adultery but do murder, you become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged under the law of liberty. What?
Yeah.
I thought we were what? What? Now there's some people who would try and say, well, this is the law of Christ. That's not what it says.
No, you can't get that out of this text.
No matter how hard you try, you can't make the text say something it doesn't. You're pigeonholed here. Okay, nobody puts baby in a corner. Well, baby just got put in a corner. There's no way that this is quote unquote the law of Christ, as if the law of Christ was distinct from the law of liberty, but we don't have time to cover that today. James explicitly says, so speak and so act as those who are to be judged under the law of liberty. Paul says the same thing. We covered this. We have covered this. This was in Romans 2 and 3. Paul is in complete agreement. those who are under the law will be judged by the law, and those who do not have the law, their consciences will bear witness against them at the last day, when, according to my gospel, Christ Jesus, Yeshua HaMashiach, judges the hearts and minds of men. So, again, stop. To the people who are listening to this, who might be holdouts, who are watching this, who might be holdouts, maybe you're gnashing your teeth at me, maybe you're actually listening right now and not upset. And for those who are keeping Torah, keep it up. James flatly says, so speak and so act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty, the law of freedom. For judgment is without mercy to one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. I'm going to read that again. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. At this point, I want to inject a parable of Yeshua to show that James is in perfect agreement with his brother Yeshua. This is the parable of the man who owed a king a great sum of money. Right? And I'm blanking on the address right now. But in this parable, you have this ruler who calls one of his servants in. And he basically says, you owe me this extraordinary amount of money in the order of a magnitude that there's no way the guy can repay it. And it's really clear the guy can't repay it. And he pleads for mercy. The servant pleads for mercy. And the king gives it to him. He says, you know what? Forget the debt. All right, I get it. You can't pay the debt. Forget the debt. And then that servant goes out and finds a servant of his who owes him money. And the man pleads and says, I am so sorry, I will pay you. And it was a minuscule debt. This is a very small debt compared to what this other servant had owed the king. And so this middleman servant has his servant thrown in jail until he repays it. Well, the king finds out about this, calls him in and says, what are you doing? I forgave you your debt. Now you're going to go to jail. And you're not going to get out. And Yeshua closes that parable indicating he's not going to get out until he pays the last penny. Like this guy is in jail, and it's kind of inferred again by the sum of money. He's never going to repay it. So here we see James in perfect agreement with Yeshua. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. So that's what happened with that king and that servant. Mm-hmm. The king showed him mercy, but that servant did not show mercy in turn. So what is James' conclusion? Mercy triumphs over judgment. So if you show mercy, this is forgive, because if you don't forgive, your heavenly Father won't forgive you. This is a complete alignment. We owe a debt in the form of death that we cannot ourselves repay, because you cannot earn works by salvation, or earn salvation by works. Flip that. Okay. So James is saying here, show mercy and act like you're going to be judged under the law of liberty too. So be careful. Now, tie into James 4. When we read James 4, there's a passage here, again, where people try to rip stuff out of context. And what they try to rip out of context is specifically verses 11 to verse 12. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is only one lawgiver and judge, he who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? So there's that famous line, who are you to judge your neighbor? Only God can judge me. Nobody can judge me. I'm free. You can't judge me at all for anything that I've done, because only God can. And you just recapitulate. I'm saying the same thing over and over because it's only God can judge me, right? The context of this is linked to James chapter 2. Okay, in James chapter 2, he speaks of the royal law.
Right, yeah.
Okay. Love your neighbor as yourself. So this person in James chapter 4, let's actually break this passage down. And again, the reason I'm bringing in James today is because I want to show that James was a consistent Torah observer that's not a raging, power drunk elder that just forces people what he wants them to do. James is intent on keeping that Torah, just like Paul was. And so James is giving you a Torah lesson on Leviticus chapter 19. So what I'd like for us to do is go ahead and turn to Leviticus chapter 19 real quick. Got your Bibles. This is always helpful.
Yeah, and I'm doing a research here, by the way. Matthew 5, it does say pay the last penny, but I don't think it's the story you were talking about. So I am looking that up while you go to, you're going Leviticus 18 or 19?
19.
19, yep.
Yeah. So Matthew 5 is when Yeshua says, settle your debts while you're on your way to the court.
Yeah. So I was wrong on that. That's not
the parable.
Yep. Sorry about that, folks.
No, it's okay. I do it sometimes too.
Well, it happens.
So this is the passage that James has in reference when he's speaking in his epistle. Is you look at Leviticus chapter 19, verse 9. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to the edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes from your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. You shall not steal. You shall not deal falsely. You shall not lie to one another. So yeah, lying is a commandment, folks. Okay? You shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of your God. Isn't it interesting? He mentions the name. James mentions the name, right? You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. This is what James is getting into with the rich man. This is one of those things I cannot overemphasize the importance of looking at Leviticus 19 and understanding that the New Testament writers, all they are doing is pulling from the Torah. Again, verse 13, you shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until morning. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall do. Now, this is where we get to with James 4, this judgment passage, and is you shall not do, or you shall do no injustice. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. You shall do not go around as a slanderer amongst your people, and you shall not stand up against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So let's go back to James 4. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. So what's going on here? the person who is speaking evil against his brother is then judging his brother, but the person who's doing this is already in the wrong. They're already in sin because they're speaking evil. This person's already in sin.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to read this again. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. James is saying this person who's in this category, the one who speaks against his brother, is this one speaking evil against his brother. This person's already condemned as a lawbreaker according to Leviticus 19. And what he's doing is he's perverting justice. He's perverting righteousness. He says, this is going back to Leviticus 19:15, you shall not do injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slander amongst your people. So the person, again, that's in James 4, this is a person who's breaking the Torah and is acting wickedly at this moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so James' conclusion is a person who speaks evil against his brother and then attempts to judge his brother is actually speaking evil against the law and judges the law, because what they're doing is a flagrant disregard for what the law says. And they're saying, I'm going to disregard the law. That's what this person's doing. And it says, James then says, but if you judge the law, if you're going to say, I'm going to judge the law and I'm going to say, I'm not going to do this, this is good in my eyes, I'm going to continue to speak evil against my brother, and I'm going to judge him. James' conclusion is, if you do this, you're not a doer of the law, but you're a judge of the law, in parentheses. This is another thing. You're supposed to have judges in the assembly. Paul explicitly says, who am I to judge those outside of the assembly? Right? But we're supposed to judge those who are inside the assembly. Are we not to judge those who are inside the house of God? Okay, so this idea that nobody's going to judge you, you're self-deceived. If you really think that, that's really foolish. And by the way, it's far better for a brother or sister to come to you in love and say, hey, look, what you're doing is sin, than for you to continue on in your sin and wait the time until you are judged by God. Because the correction that comes from a brother or sister in this life, as James says, covers over a multitude of sins. So this passage, but if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is only one lawgiver and judge, he who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? And that's the passage that gets ripped out of context. Who are you to judge your neighbor?
Now that reference I know, 1 Corinthians 5:12, for our viewers, listeners.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind reading that for them.
Yeah, sure. Let's see here. You're using ESV today, is that right?
I'm using ESV.
Okay, so what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge?
Yeah.
It does say it kind of right there.
It's right there. So again, seeking a consistent God, let's look at his followers who have set the bar for what it looks like to imitate Yeshua and follow him. This is Paul saying this. Your freedom from the law, Paul. He says, judge those inside the church. Well, how on earth can you judge without the law? That's an impossible task.
You can't.
It's impossible, because then what you're doing is you're actually doing, that's why I'm doing a circular logic today. It might not be the most exciting podcast, but it's a beans and bullets teaching today, if you will, or discussion.
I have never heard that term.
Beans and bullets. In the military, that's what you need beans and you need bullets.
Okay.
You gotta eat.
Makes
and
sense.
You gotta be able to fight.
Okay, makes sense.
Beans and bullets. So do not speak evil against one another, brothers, for the one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. This person is already warped. They're already in sin. And the context of it, if you were to actually go back up, what causes quarrels, verse 1, and what causes fights amongst you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire, so you do not. You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You don't have because you don't ask. You ask because you don't receive. Because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. That passage right there, you do not have because you do not ask, and you do not ask, you do not receive. This whole thing has been ripped out of context to say, well, you don't ask of God, so you don't get it. That's not what it's talking about at all. This is talking about between brothers. If you need money, go ask your brother and borrow the money. And he says you don't have because you don't ask. Right? Just go ask your brother if you need money. Don't resent him in your heart that he has money and you don't, or that he has an oxen and you don't, or that he has a good milk goat and you don't. If you're thirsty and your well is run dry, go ask your brother. Don't steal water at night. Don't go steal the goat because you have no milk. I mean, this is common. Don't go to your brother's field and steal grapes. Right? He says, you ask and you do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. You don't get it because everybody knows that you're going and asking the person this thing with wrong motives. That's why they're not going to give it to you. They don't give you wine because they know you're a drunkard. Right? You don't, I mean, this is so basic level community teaching. This has nothing to do with asking God. This has everything to do with quarrels and what causes fight amongst yourselves. He says, you adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? So they're saying you're acting like the world.
Yeah, as I was reading James 2 and 4, what struck me was that you and I are talking about it in part to help our brothers and sisters out here listening to us, that the God's instruction, the law, is valid for Christian living and helping us understand how to do Christian community. Whereas, that's the thrust of James 2 and 4. For them was a foregone conclusion. Why would not we follow God's righteous instruction? And we need to apply it properly. And so they're not trying to convince anyone to follow the law. They're just rightly applying the law so that they can get along with each other and live righteously.
It's stated as a matter of fact.
It is.
Covenant obedience is assumed.
It is assumed, right.
It's the same thing in John. 1 John, 2 John, covenant obedience is assumed. Okay? So now with loading that all in, draw near to God, verse 8, and he will draw near to you. Well, actually, I'm going to start in verse 7. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. This is all talking about passions. This is going back to Genesis chapter 3 with Cain and Abel. Sin is crouching at your doorstep, Cain, and it desires to master you, but you must rule over it. Same thing. It's a Genesis 2. Genesis 3, Genesis 4. So Cain and Abel is Genesis 4. The fall is Genesis 3. The devil plays on Eve's desires, her passions. She wanted to be like God. Same thing with Adam. Okay, so what does he say? Resist the devil and he'll flee. Submit to God. Well, what is that? The Torah. Submit to the Lord and his Torah, because that's what everything he's getting at. James is indicting people as lawbreakers here. Submit to God. Well, what does it mean to submit to God? It means to keep his ways.
Yeah, and two, when James refers to the law of liberty, all he's doing is using the same language that the psalmist is using, for example, in Psalm 119.
I was just going to, that's exactly it. Psalm 119, verse 113. I hate the double-minded man, is what the psalmist says in Psalm 119. And that's exactly what James says. He says, you double-minded.
Yeah. And that, because I'm going through Romans, this is exactly Paul's point in Romans, is if you hand the members of your body over to unrighteousness, you become a slave of it. There's no liberty in unrighteousness.
Right.
Free yourself from that and become a slave to righteousness, not to unrighteousness, because in being a slave to righteousness, there is freedom in that. You get the logic.
Right. No, that's exactly it. So if another verse is Peter and Paul are both in the same category. 1 Peter 2:16, live in freedom, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Galatians 5:13, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Okay, so again, we find all of these elders, all of these, we find Paul, James, and Peter, they're all in agreement here. And then James uses the term law of liberty. Don't use your freedom now that you've been freed from sin, right? Don't do that to indulge the flesh. Quite the opposite. Now you need to start restraining yourself when it comes to your passions, your lusts, your desires. And here, again, sorry I'm beating I don't know, a dead horse, probably the wrong analogy, but sorry to continue to say the same thing over and over, but I really want our listeners to get this. When somebody brings you this passage in James 4, verse 11, do not speak evil against one another, brothers. I want you to immediately flip on Leviticus 19. Go read Leviticus 19. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. If you come to your brother with evil intent, showing partiality, showing disregard for what God has commanded, and you attempt to judge your brother, you speak evil against the law and judge the law because you're saying, that's actually not good, what God said. I'm not going to do it. And you actually become a judge of the law. So James' conclusion is, if you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law anymore, but a judge. So you're now a lawbreaker because you're not submitting. And he goes further and says, there's only one lawgiver, guys, and judge. He who is able to save and to destroy. He says, you're taking the place of God. You're judging his law to be evil, and you yourself are setting yourself up as God. You're committing the Genesis 3 sin. And this is our first podcast going all the way back. Are you going to do what is right in your own eyes? Or are you going to do what is right in the eyes of the Lord? This is huge. Every day is a choice. Every day you decide, am I going to resist the devil? It's not going to be easy sometimes. There's an opportunity in Acts 21 for people to take a look at that and say, well, Paul's just doing what's right in his own eyes. James and the elders are just doing what's right in their own eyes. Really? Is that really what's going on? Are they really doing what is right in their own eyes? Because that would make them lawbreakers. Again, you and I have this same option put in front of us every single day. Are we going to be doers of the word, doers of the law? Are we going to resist the devil even though our passions ply against us? Maybe I see something that I want. How am I going to try and get that thing? If I have an excess, why doesn't my brother just come to me and ask out of the abundance of my own blessing? I would freely give if I'm able. Don't set yourself up to be God. You're not. Don't set yourself up to be in a position to judge when you are not the, again, lawgiver. But certainly don't set yourself up to be judged if you're going to come against somebody with evil intent. Every day it's a choice. And for us, we're supposed to uphold that Torah every day, right?
That's right. Yeshua did it. We need to be doing it. And that's why we call it Everyday Torah. We'll see you next time.